Starting the June 6, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. Mr. King, will you take roll?
Daly,
Here.
Friedrich,
Here.
Honig,
Here.
Horgan,
Here.
Irwin,
Here.
Kostreva, Leash,
Here.
Ortman,
Here.
Rise.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes for the May 2nd regular meeting.
Move to approve the Mason.
Second. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is Zoning Board of Appeals report.
Madam Chair, we did not meet.
Thank you, Commissioner Friedrich. Next item on the agenda is communications. Mr. Kane?
Madam Chair, you had one communication which you received on the dais this evening in regards to our first case tonight, SUP 1907.
Thank you. And next item on the agenda is public hearings, SUP 1907. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first and only public hearing tonight is a special use permit request at 437 South Mission Street. This is a request to allow a special regulated use, which is under the category of palm readers, psychic readers, horoscope analysis, or other professions purporting to predict the future in the CD4 district. The subject property is zoned CD4 with a future land use of commercial/mission redevelopment overlay district. The current use of the property is as a mixed use. There's a retail store on the ground level of this property with an apartment upstairs. Property owner is GK Banaski Properties LLC, and the site area is just over 1/3 of an acre. The subject property is located on Mission Street. This is on the east side of Mission Street. Immediately to the south is a office building. Immediately to the north is Rhino's Car Wash. It is essentially at the intersection of Mission and Locust Streets. The zoning of the properties north, south, and west of the subject property is the same as the subject property, CD4 General Urban, with the same future land use category of commercial/mission redevelopment overlay district. The properties immediately to the west are zoned CD3 Suburban with a future land use of urban residential. Photograph on the screen is current conditions of the subject property looking from Mission Street toward the northeast. As I mentioned before, this property is currently a mixed-use building with the All Things Divine Boutique occupying the first level and there being an apartment located on the second level of the subject property. Here's a view of the rear of the building. You'll see the parking lot on this property is located at the rear. Mission Street would be on the opposite side of this building. As I mentioned before, there is a car wash located just to the north, which would be to the right in this image, and an office building which is located to the left or south of this property. Immediately across the street, there's actually another car wash as well. It's a predominant land use in the immediate vicinity. The proposed use is considered a Group B special regulated use under our zoning ordinance. You'll recall special regulated uses are those that might have serious effect on nearby properties and uses, on people residing or working in the vicinity, on infrastructure, or on public services, particularly if they're concentrated within the area, and therefore they are regulated as a special use and subject to additional controls on their location, which differ from our other special uses in the zoning code, with their relationship to those other special regulated uses, as well as with their relationship to residential areas and similar uses. In terms of that review of the uses specific to a Group B special regulated use, within 1,000 feet of the subject property, there are located two other special regulated uses. The first is at 201 South Mission Street, the Speedway gas station. You'll recall that earlier this year, a special regulated use was approved to allow beer and wine sales out of that Speedway gas station, which classifies it under our code as a liquor store. The other special regulated use is similarly would be at 629 South Mission Street, the Next Door store, which also received special use permit approval as a special regulated use to permit beer and wine sales as part of that gas station convenience store. Secondarily, we look at the relationship of the proposed use to residential areas and other uses, which would include mobile home parks, K-12 schools, civic spaces, churches, and cemeteries. And that's within 300 feet of the proposed use. Within 300 feet, there are 20 properties which are zoned CD3, which is one of our 2 residential districts in the city, as well as 1 K through 12 school, which is the White Pine Montessori Center, which is located at the corner of Maple and Arnold Streets. The Planning Commission can take action to waive those location standards subject to subsection 410C6A of the zoning ordinance if the following findings are made. 1, that the proposed use is not contrary to the public interest or injurious to nearby properties, and that the spirit of the section regulating special regulated uses will be observed. B, that the proposed use will not enlarge or encourage a Skid Row area. C, that the establishment of an additional special regulated use in the area is not contrary to any city programs related to neighborhood conservation or urban renewal, and that all applicable sections of the zoning code with regard to special regulated uses will be observed. You'll note in staff's recommendation tonight, similar to other special regulated use cases we've considered in the recent past, I'm recommending that as part of your findings, that you include conditions that relate to that finding section that's in your staff report. So staff tonight, I am recommending that the special use permit be approved subject to those waiver standards and findings that are included in the zoning ordinance. The applicant, as well as the property owner, are present tonight to answer any questions you might have about their project and the proposed use, and I welcome any questions from the Planning Commission as well. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Kane? If the applicant would like to come up.
How you doing? I'm Greg Banaski. This is my wife, Christy Banaski. We're the ones putting in for the special use permit.
Does anyone have any questions for the applicant? Well, thank you. I guess we don't have any questions.
That's good.
So if you want to sit down, I'll start the public comment portion of this hearing. If anyone from the public would like to say anything, now would be your opportunity to do so. Seeing no one, I'm closing public comment and opening discussion.
The building looks great.
I agree.
Yeah, it does.
Anyone want to make a
Are
motion?
there, with the special regulated use, just to clarify the other special regulated uses, does this set a precedent if we allow a waiving of the rules for one particular property? Does that mean we kind of have to waive the rules for all the properties?
No, that's a great question, Commissioner Rise. Essentially, any special regulated use that's permitted requires a waiver of the rules. So that would be, in order to allow these uses, they require those waivers. So you're not setting a precedent because you're considering each of those cases on a case-by-case basis. If, kind of what you're alluding to, if waiving the standards in one case meant that every future case you'd have to waive the standards, essentially approving one special regulated use in the community would mean that there'd be no sense in having special regulated use standards anymore. So you still have an opportunity with every proposal to review it against those location standards and determine if whether that use in that context would contribute to any of those symptoms and reject that use as a result.
Well, particularly the school, within the 300 feet of the school, I know that we spent a long time discussing other special regulated uses and the distance from schools. So are we then deciding one over the other?
Hasn't that discussion mostly been around marijuana more than anything?
Yes.
And part of the reason that was so contentious was the federal law still prohibits marijuana within a certain distance of schools.
Okay.
I mean, certainly if you have a problem with it being within a proximity of a school, that's fine.
I have no problem with the use, period. I don't know why it's special regulated. I think it's rather benign in terms of what it would do in a neighborhood. It's, I mean, in my opinion, not much different than counseling or any other type of consulting service, but since it is on our list of special regulated uses, I think that, that merits the notion that why is it on our list? And that's my question.
And that's a great question. And it's been on the, as long as the city has had special regulated use standards, which I believe those came into effect in the late 1980s, it's been included on that list. When we produced the new use table for the new zoning code, we did eliminate some special regulated uses from the list, moved them either to a special use category or to a use permitted by right category. We didn't do that for all uses, however, and this one was one that shift didn't occur from. It's certainly something that we could put on a list for the future when we, if we're entertaining other changes to the use table, it might be appropriate to look at whether or not something like this or that entire list, whether it's still relevant and appropriate for those things to be categorized in that way. So we can certainly take that feedback under advisement.
I think it's not in the same class as marijuana facilities. I'm hoping if there's a big rush from the schools, to see how I'm going to do on that exam, the first question is, did you study?
Well, I do want to clarify that marijuana facilities are not classified as a special regulated use under our code. They're a special use. So we've got basically permitted uses, special uses, and then special regulated uses. So special regulated uses is a very small list of uses. Most uses in the community are permitted. Some are permitted by special use permit. It just happens that we use basically the same procedure with some additional location-related requirements for special regulated uses as opposed to traditional special uses.
Any other discussion or a motion?
I move to approve SUP 1907 with the following findings and conditions. The proposed use will not be contrary to the public interest or injurious to nearby properties, and that the spirit and intent of this section 154.410.c will be observed. The proposed use will not enlarge or encourage the development of a skid row area. The establishment of additional special regulated use in the area will not be contrary to any program of neighborhood conservation or interfere with any program of urban renewal. All applicable regulations of this section 154.410.c will be observed.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is public comment. If anyone wants to make a comment, this is your last opportunity to do so. Seeing no one, I'm closing public comment, and next item is SPR 1910. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first and only site plan review this evening is, in my opinion, a pretty exciting one. This is a site plan review for 410 West Broadway Street, the property located next to the building we're currently seated in. This is an application for Michigan Community Capital to construct a 51,010 square foot mixed-use building with approximately 10,000 square feet of commercial space and 48 multiple family dwelling units. The current use, as you all know, is vacant land. The property owner is the city's Economic Development Corporation, and the site area is 1.4 acres. As I mentioned, this property is located immediately to the west of the Borden Building in which Mount Pleasant City Hall is located. The current land use of the site is CD5 Urban Center. That's the same land use as the properties to the east and west of the site. Property immediately to the north of the property is located in our civic zone and is the location of Island Park. Property immediately to the south is also zoned civic zone, and that's the location of one of the city's downtown parking lots. Here's some pictures. These were current conditions as of the time that I put my slideshow together. As you've noticed, hopefully we've got some asphalt down on West Broadway Street. And I did put a clarification note in your packet. The site site was looking a little bit different for the last month, as it's been used in part for some staging area to help facilitate that reconstruction project on West Broadway Street. So just understand that that's obviously not the way this property typically looks on a normal day. This is looking at the site from the south side of West Broadway Street, looking toward the northeast, so looking toward the Borden Building and across at the distance to the Chippewa River. Here's a view of the property from the opposite perspective. So this is from that Oak Street pedestrian bridge into Island Park, looking toward the southwest. You'll see some of those vehicles that are parked there, that being that public parking lot that's located immediately south of the subject property. And looking over the site plan, both of the uses that are proposed for this property, which is the general retail on the ground level and then multifamily apartments with family occupancy, those are both uses that are permitted by right in the CD5 zoning district. Neither of those uses requires a special use permit. So we're basically tonight just looking at this site plan to determine whether or not it conforms with the standards of the zoning ordinance, which it does. Essentially, the footprint of the building is located here. It's an L-shaped building oriented with its primary corner here at the entrance to City Hall and the Borden Building Complex, which is at the terminus of Oak Street. The building does wrap around and front along West Broadway Street. There is a trail connection from the sidewalk on West Broadway Street around the back of the building to an area where there's currently a trail, which dead ends roughly in this area at the rear northwest corner of the site. The project includes parking of 64 parking spaces on site for use by the retail establishment, and would include the opportunity, like other downtown developments, to utilize the several public parking areas which are located within immediate proximity of this property. Here's a rendering of the proposed building. There are several more renderings included in your packet. I selected one. Again, this would be looking, if I were standing at this would be the southeast corner of West Broadway and Oak Street, the property owned by Mr. Irwin, Commissioner Irwin, looking toward the north and west. So to our right of this image would be Mount Pleasant City Hall. To the left would be the entrance to the salon and restaurants. And then obviously at the distance would be the railroad tracks. The proposed building is a 4-story building, as I mentioned, mixed-use retail, commercial space on the ground level, and multifamily apartments located on the 3 stories above. As I mentioned, the proposed project complies with all relevant standards of the zoning ordinance for the CD5 zoning district, which include the setback, building standard, encroachment, vehicular parking standard, bicycle parking standards, service, loading, and meter standards, fencing and landscaping, lighting, screens, streetscape improvements, etc. So therefore, staff is recommending approval of site plan 1910 with the following condition, that the applicant comply with the requirements of Public Works and Public Safety. We do have representatives here tonight from Integrated Architecture, which is the firm which developed the plans for this project, and I'm sure they would be happy to answer any questions that the Planning Commission has. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Kane?
Yeah, I got a couple. Looking on the plans here, there's a notation about a 100-year floodplain berm. What's that about?
100-year floodplain berm. Well, I will tell you, because I know this issue's come up, and I will first say that I'm not the expert on floodplains for the city. But essentially, when the city developed the Borden complex, one of the things that they looked at was filling this site so that it was brought out of the floodplain. In order to get a letter of map amendment that officially brings a property out of a floodplain, you have to have a structure on that property. You're not able to get that letter of map amendment for a vacant piece of property. So essentially, all the work has been done to prepare that letter of map amendment and to facilitate that being issued. But until the building is present on the site, that letter can't be issued.
Is that issued from the state?
That is issued from federal government.
Okay, maybe the architects or whatever would know the answers to this question, but according to the state building code, the first floor has to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation?
And this project would be above that level.
Okay, so we do know that.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I had a couple other questions. There's a notation on here about something about installing a utility line burying a utility line?
Yes, so the site currently is traversed roughly north to south by a city storm sewer. And so that storm sewer is basically taking discharge from properties that are uphill of the river, so mainly to the south of this site, and discharging that stormwater across the site into the Chippewa River. This project would involve the relocation of that storm line to an easement area that would essentially follow the west property line to a manhole cover where it would rejoin the existing discharge outlet into the Chippewa River.
Okay, so that's not electrical, that's drainage.
Well, there's two things going on. So that's drainage.
Okay.
The second is that the city is working with the developer on the overhead transmission lines that currently run in front of the site
Okay.
to facilitate those being underground or relocated so that they're not essentially out the window of the apartment units that would be built on the property.
Do we know where they're gonna get relocated to?
It appears the tentative plan is for those to be relocated into a common easement area near that sanitary sewer line before rejoining an above-ground system.
Okay, and moving the pump station? Do we know where that's going?
It appears that will be going, it was previously in the recent past on the south side of Broadway Street, and it appears that that is what will happen again, as it'll move to city-owned property that's located on the south side of the road.
Okay, so it's going on to the corner of that city-owned parking lot?
More or less, that's my understanding.
Okay, well, it should be more than less. I mean, it's being moved completely across the street.
Right.
Okay, so we're not gonna have to tear up that street we just put in, are we?
No.
Okay. Is the city paying for all this themselves, or is the developer paying for this?
We're currently working with the developer and the state on different funding options for that. So it's not completely known at this point.
So we don't know who's paying for this at this point?
No, not with certainty, no.
Okay. And the parking seems to be a little slim on this, and there's no entrance? They're using the city hall entrance as the entrance to their building?
It'd be a shared entrance with the entire complex, the entire condominium association.
So any tractor trailers that have to get to the loading dock's gonna have to make that tight hairpin turn in the middle of a crowded parking lot?
They're able to do it. I mean, they've designed the site to accommodate truck deliveries for the proposed tenant, so.
And are the tenants gonna be parking at City Hall, some of them? Is that the plan?
I would expect that some of them will, yes.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Kane? If the applicant would like to come up.
Hello, my name is Daryl DeHaan with Integrated Architecture in Grand Rapids. I'm here on behalf of Michigan Community Capital, our client representing the project. Also have with me Justin Longstreth from Warren Brujink, the civil engineer on the project. So any questions about the site, utilities, underground easements, civil, I'll have Justin join me, but I can answer any questions that you might have about the architectural components of the project.
So who is the client?
The client is
The owner?
Michigan Community Capital. They're a developer based in Lansing. Currently working with them, and so as many of you are aware, I think from an economic development standpoint, there's many milestones that we are still working on and working with the city in terms of the entitlement process first and foremost, as well as the DPW components of the project. On the client side, still working on a lot of state and local incentives, financing, so they're a developer, essentially.
Do they have other projects?
Yes, we're working on 5 other projects with them currently. One in Grayling, one in Boyne City, one in Lansing, one in Grand Haven, and one in Flint. So they're very active. They've committed around $35 million to these projects over the next 2 years.
I do have a few questions maybe you could answer. Does the state require a hydrology study on a new construction on a floodplain?
I'll let Justin climbing out of his chair when you answered that. I'll let Justin address that, civil engineer on the
Sure.
project.
Good evening, Justin Longstreth with Morenbridge Inc. Related to the floodplain, what we would be required to do as part of this project is apply for a permit with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. A hydraulic study, I don't think for this particular project would be required, but what we would need to analyze is how much fill is being placed in the floodplain. And likely, we'd have to mitigate that fill. Basically, whatever you put in, you have to also take out so that that floodplain elevation remains the same.
Yes, I was unsure about that phrase mitigation, taking soil out. If you put soil in, where do you take that from?
It can be a number of places. It doesn't necessarily need to be right on this site specific. In the general vicinity, we can find locations to help mitigate that.
Okay, and that's something we don't know if that's going to happen yet.
It's one of the many steps in the process. Yes, that is an application that we have yet to be, or yet to make, but one that we're very aware of that we need to make.
It would conform with state requirements.
Yes, I would assume so. That's why I was kind of asking about that. And do we know what the base flood elevation is for this piece of property?
Elevation, 752.5.
And is that above, how far above grade is that elevation?
18 inches. It varies across the site, but anywhere between 2 feet and 18 inches.
Okay, yeah, so basically this building is going to have to be elevated 3 feet? Is that the current plan?
The elevation of the building is roughly 756.50, so the building is going to be 4 feet above the finish, or above the 100-year floodplain. That's really more of a function of the elevation of the road out front. Because we're so close to the back of the curb, we can't have the building stick way up or way low compared to the road grade. So that's really where we're tied to. And then in the back, what we're trying to do is limit the amount of fill that we're placing, so we are sloping off to the north in an effort to limit the amount of fill that's required.
Okay, but that flood elevation number, you got what, from the feds or from the state, based on the last flood? Is that-
Yes, it's based on floodplain maps that are published by FEMA.
Yes, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, one more question. The electrical, now, doesn't it have to have a special installation in the floodplain if you put it underground?
I believe that the underground portion of that relocation is right along
That's
Broadway.
still in the floodplain. The floodplain goes across the street. It's a
Um,
little vague on the maps that you see online, so it might not, but
Not in this location. It's not.
it's pretty close.
There is a finger of the river that does extend up, but where we're placing it underground, right along Broadway here, is not in the floodplain.
Okay.
Are there issues with having a parking lot of paved, well, a lot of paved surface, a building is not porous, and then the parking lot, and then being so close to a river in terms of runoff in a place which probably absorbs a good amount of the moisture that hits it?
Yep, so we will have measures in place to pre-treat the water, the storm water, before it discharges to the river. So you're right, the parking lot is going to collect sediment and debris, but we're gonna put systems in place that clean that water on site prior to discharging, and those systems require regular maintenance, whether or not that's a year or 2 times a year. A Vector truck would come to the site and suck that sediment out.
What is that, a series of sieves or something?
There are a number of systems that we could select. Some are baffles, where you've got some baffles that stop sediment and others that stop oil, so there's many different options.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant? Thank you. And I'll open up discussion. There's no public comment for site plans.
Well, cool. it works, comes to pass.
Yeah, no, it's huge. Huge for our downtown.
Any other discussion or a motion?
Move to approve SPR 1910, subject to the following condition. Comply with the requirements of the Division of Public Works and of Public Safety.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is unfinished business, the amendment, discussing an amendment to section 154-114 of the zoning ordinance. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next item is a draft ordinance for your consideration related to our conversation last month regarding non-existing parking areas. Based on the substance of that conversation, staff put together this draft amendment to the nonconformity section of the zoning ordinance, which would basically address the concern that was brought forward in the manner in which the Planning Commission indicated last month you were comfortable with. The draft amendment has been vetted by the city attorney. Basically tonight, just looking for action to set the public hearing for your next meeting, which might as well remind you now, our July meeting is June 27th, because the first Thursday in July is July 4th. So just looking for you to set that public hearing so that we could move that forward through the process.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane?
I have a question on, it says, can we read it?
I don't have it on the slide, but we all have it in our packet, so.
Okay. Well, I'll read it. It says, "A parking lot lawfully existing upon the effective date of this chapter that does not meet the parking location requirements of Table 154405A may be reconstructed provided it complies with all other standards of the zoning ordinance and is associated with the permitted land use." My question is, Table 154405A, is that this whole section of our zoning book?
Correct. It's the standards for each of our zoning districts in the city in terms of the location of various site items.
Okay, so it refers to locations of various site items?
Correct.
So we don't really regulate anything in the reconstruction with this? It basically says if it doesn't meet any of the setbacks, we can reconstruct it, provided, it's vague, is I guess my question, meets all other standards.
So essentially what this is saying is that if the location standard isn't met or can't be met, it can be rebuilt, but it's still going to have to meet other standards of that section. So if there are standards related to dimensional standards for a parking lot, if we have an existing parking lot that's non-conforming in terms of dimensions, it's going to have to be rebuilt in a manner that is conforming with dimensional standards.
So let me give an example.
Sure.
My driveway is 2 cars wide, 20-some feet. And the new ordinance says it can only be 16 feet wide, right?
Well, I want to be clear, your driveway is not a parking lot. So right off the bat, I mean, this is really only relevant to non-single-family residential uses.
So multiple family.
Multiple
use.
family,
So
commercial,
a
retail,
multiple
office.
family use that has a driveway that's too wide
Right.
could be reconstructed and put somewhere else, but it couldn't have the width changed, or it has to have, I don't know how I don't know how we would ever enforce it. That's my question.
It'd be the same manner that we enforce all of our standards through a site plan process. So if somebody comes forward with a site plan to staff or to the Planning Commission, they're required to demonstrate compliance with the code. So what this is basically saying is that you need to demonstrate with compliance with the code with regard to a reconstructed parking lot, with the exception of that location standard, which is essentially what we discussed at the last meeting.
So you could put a parking lot that's in the front, in the back.
You could already
according
do
to
that.
this.
What this is saying is if you had a parking lot that was in the front yard and that front yard location is a non-conforming location, you could reconstruct it in the front yard, provided all the other standards are met.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I want to make sure it makes sense. I don't want to move it forward. So essentially, let me give you just a hypothetical example, and this is not based on a real property in town, but let's just say, for instance, we had a property that was a commercial use, and it had 8 parking spaces located in the front yard, which had no drive aisle. So basically, everybody's just stacking parking in the front of the building. That, in and of itself, doesn't meet the zoning and hasn't for decades on a number of fronts. This would allow that parking area to be reconstructed, but it's going to have to be designed in a way that facilitates egress and ingress in a way that complies with code standards. So that might require reorienting the spaces. That might lead to a reduction in spaces in that instance, but it at least allows for the possibility of reconstruction in a way that the code wouldn't have allowed now or 30 years in the past.
But they have to come through the site plan process.
They would need to come through a site plan process, yes.
Would they have to come through a site plan process anytime they change their parking lot?
Yes.
But administrative review would be possible?
Yes, yeah, if a project isn't resulting in a net change of more than 25 parking spaces, it's eligible for administrative review unless it's associated with a special use. And that's simply because special uses are subject to a public process.
So I took a picture of a parking lot in Mount Pleasant. This is within city limits. It's got a giant hole. So this landowner, if it was a non-conforming use, would not be allowed to reconstruct this parking lot.
They would not be allowed to fully reconstruct it, no. Could they fill the pothole? Yes. They've always been able to do that.
More than a pothole. It's like way down. It's like 4 feet down.
Why haven't they fixed it yet?
I mean,
Yeah, there's always been a repair allowance under any circumstance, and you can pull back from that pothole and properly fix it. What we're really talking about is somebody who's removing an entire parking lot and putting a brand-new parking lot in its place.
Just as a, for instance, say a property owner had a concrete parking lot cracked up. Can you remove that concrete and put in a new asphalt parking lot?
Absolutely, yep. The only thing you wouldn't be able to do is take if you're in a district that requires hard surfacing for parking or have a use that requires that, you couldn't revert it to gravel. You'd have to maintain hard surfacing. So, we wouldn't allow McDonald's to take their parking lot out and put a gravel parking lot in its place, but you can go the other direction and you can switch hard surface materials, whether it's pavers to concrete or concrete to asphalt or any permutation of those hard surfacing options.
Before this or because of this?
Well, it just depends on the context. If you had a conforming parking lot, you can reconstruct it anyway. We're really dealing with a small subset of parking lots that are locationally non-compliant. So, to go back to your example of the pothole, if we had a non-conforming use, so let's say we have a liquor store in a residential neighborhood, if the hole is in the roof, there's nothing in our code that stops that hole from being repaired. And the pothole's the same. You're allowed to keep an existing property to maintain it. What you can't do is you couldn't tear the liquor store down and rebuild it. And so tearing out the non-conforming parking lot and rebuilding it is also not an option.
And at our joint meeting, there was a bit of a hue and cry about, well, they can't fix their parking lots because code makes them do a lot of things. Code still makes them do a lot of things if indeed they've got a parking lot that's too narrow or not enough parking spots or...
Code doesn't make somebody fixing a parking lot do anything that someone wouldn't have to do adding a room to a building or doing any number of other things to a building. And that's been the case historically. Our site plan process, the trigger is very low. If you change a landscape area, if you change a parking area, if you add a square foot to a building, you're triggering a site plan process. And that's been the case since 1984.
Yeah. I think that's the part I have the problem with is triggering a site plan process for changing landscaping or changing, just that
I mean, the challenge is the city regulates landscaping, so if the city regulates landscaping and someone can change the landscaping without a city review, then in effect, we're not regulating landscaping.
Any other questions for Mr. Kane? I'll open up discussion. Or a motion.
I mean, tonight, we're just looking to set the public hearing, so you're not approving or denying anything, you're basically just moving this forward in the process so that we can have a public hearing.
Move to set a public hearing to consider proposed text change 1902 at the June 27th, 2019 regular meeting.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is a new business presentation on the Master Plan 2050 from McKinnon Associates.
Madam Chair, we have Paul Lippens here from McKinnon Associates. He's our project manager for the 2050 Master Plan project, and he's here tonight to provide you with a 30% update on the project. Presentation, essentially a recap on the public engagement activities that occurred in the month of April, as well as all the work that's occurred since that date. So I'll turn things over to Paul.
Thank you very much. Right. Oh, here we go. On this button. All right, just making sure that we're going. I'm also here tonight with my colleague Irvin. Irvin was one of the planners that was here for the whole charrette that we did back at the beginning of April. Really fun experience. We were so excited by how many people came out and how good ideas about the growth for the city and the policy direction were shared. We got some really good feedback, and I'm here tonight to kind of provide an update on the survey results, including the charrette results, as well as the preliminary recommendations. So some of the big themes that we have. I did present with the DDA in the morning before your meeting tonight. I presented to the Parks Commission. And on Monday, I'll present for the City Commission as well. So this is our kind of 30% check-in with everyone. What do I want to cover this evening? I do want to cover a little bit about why we plan, which this commission should be the most familiar with. And I will cover a little bit of public engagement results, share some of the preliminary recommendations, and then cover next steps. And I might skip through some things. I do want to be respectful of your time, but I can always go back to any slides, answer anything, any questions that come up along the way. So why do we master plan? I think the most important thing about a master plan is creating a shared vision, and the work of the Planning Commission is really important. But you have a certain amount of things under your purview. The DDA is working on things under their purview. The Parks Commission is working on their purview, and the City Commission is working, really to guide the entire city. Additionally, there's residents that care about all these issues and are checking in with you. So the master plan process offers that opportunity to do that check-in, to create that shared vision, and to really set policy to guide a number of the city's efforts. It's also an iterative process. So while we're looking 20 years into the future, we're really focused on what can be done over the next 5 years to move the city in that direction. It's not a plan that's supposed to sit in time. It's a plan that really is meant to capture the vision now and to capture it in a way that people are excited about working on it so that it can be continually updated. So the master plan is the guide for that future development, and it is supportive of city zoning. It can help to clarify the zoning and clarify what types of uses are wanted and what the vision for an area is. And for Planning Commission, and it can also clarify and provide substance for many of your decisions that relate to implementing the zoning code. And the master plan is at the center of a lot of city policy around different growth. So you know the difference between master plan. You were dealing with the zoning ordinance tonight, and you know that that is an established law. It is what is required now, what people are able to build now. Your master plan is your opportunity to look into the future, look at the vision for the future, and actually set policy that could make a substantive reason for you to change or update a zoning ordinance. So the master plan, it's a long-range document. Whereas the zoning ordinance is an immediate document, it's what happens today. The master plan provides guidance. The zoning ordinance is a regulatory tool, and the master plan is more of a policy, informative document, whereas the zoning ordinance is something that's enforced, and though you don't have as much flexibility. You can have flexibility in how you interpret zoning standards, but not as to whether those standards exist. One of the important things to remember, too, about the master plan process is that this is an opportunity for us to look at future land use classifications and offer some more specificity into how we want areas of the city to develop without tying those specifically to the zoning code and the districts in the zoning code. So while they're related, they offer an opportunity for us to set policy that can influence the implementation. And also, all of the districts don't necessarily correspond to the districts exactly in the zoning code. But again, they're related conceptually. One is envisioning the growth pattern for the future. As I said prior, the master plan also is a combination of multiple subject areas. So for instance, in this current master plan update, we're focusing on the Mission Street corridor redevelopment, and we're also focusing on the Parks plan. But we're also doing the required business of the master plan update, and there are state guidelines for what we have to hit. One of those is making sure we have a zoning plan, that we're making recommendations for implementation for the CIP, and we're also trying to make practical economic development recommendations to align with the city's redevelopment-ready communities efforts. So what's unique or kind of new about the city's approach this time? We have used the charrette process. So a typical planning process might do each of these in kind of an itemized phase. First you do the analysis, then you do community guidelines, goals, objectives, alternatives, consensus, and then enter into the adoption process, and then ultimately every 5 years you would review and kind of repeat this cycle. The charrette process really is designed to accelerate and collaborate on the first 5 parts of this. So our goal in coming here in April was to come in with analysis, but also collaborate on what that analysis means, to understand the community's desires, to work through that process of developing and affirming goals and objectives, to use our understanding that we gained through that process to develop a set of alternative approaches, alternative recommendations, and then also to get feedback on those alternative recommendations and develop a consensus plan. So the charrette is designed to have these feedback loops where we present, we get feedback, we create a new set of recommendations, get feedback, incorporate that feedback, present some final results, and get feedback on that. And I was really happy that we were able to take a number of really important issues with the master plan through that process, and particularly get 2 maps that I think are of really fundamental use and relate to a lot of the master plan's policies, and that's a future transportation map and a future land use map, which I'll cover in a bit. But I do want to discuss the results. In addition to that charrette, which we personally reached out to more than 200 people in our stakeholder analysis to make sure people knew and attended that process. And we had really good results, really good participation. There were some meetings we thought 10 people were going to come, and we filled this room with people talking and being excited about the subject matter for housing, for transportation, and for working with the university, for re-envisioning the parks. We really hit on a lot of issues. But related to that, all of the things we were testing here, we wanted to provide another way for people to provide feedback on that, so we replicated those online. And we got more than 500 responses to the online surveys that we conducted, and I feel really strong about this. And what's unique, what's good about it is that a lot of what we got online matches what we heard in person. So that means we are getting to a place where we've heard a lot of the issues, heard a lot about what people care for, and have validated the direction that we've heard throughout the way. So in person, we asked people about their vision. There were a lot of comments at the charrette. The importance of parks, the importance of Mount Pleasant as a regional destination, and supporting jobs and economic development. These were some of the themes that really rose to the top. Looking at the online survey, I think that those themes were replicated in people's responses to their vision, but we kind of sorted them into these buckets, and they kind of also match the goal areas for the city. And then, the great thing about forming a vision this way or testing a vision this way is that we can actually hear from people. Some of the people were, really sophisticated in the writing of vision statements, like small town atmosphere with cultural, entertainment, and sports opportunities usually associated with big cities. A city that offers multiple generations, safe, appealing neighborhoods, excellent public services, opportunities for economic development, growth, growth that meets the needs of the future. That person may have written a vision statement at some point in their life, and that's great. And then, we also got some more, less formal writing, but all of it was really good. And, we'll present some of these great quotes in the plan so that you can see what residents said. But we also, have this documented so anyone can kind of look through all the feedback as part of an appendix, essentially, to the report. So I mentioned, I've got quotes here for all of those areas. I'm not going to stop and read them tonight, but this presentation will be made available following the several presentations we made on the website. There is a website for the project, so people can read through. As far as the goals, we asked for feedback on 5 goal areas: sustainable land use, connected mobility systems, focused redevelopment, exceptional parks and public spaces, and innovative services. And in person, we asked people to, choose amongst a limited number of dots, that they could cast, voting for what they thought were the most important objectives in these areas. And, this is what rose to the top for sustainable land use, encouraging housing mix, assisted living, downsizing, places for families, spaces for students, first-time homebuyers was an important goal. And then what came up in a number of the themes was continuing to encourage redevelopment that locates people in walkable bicycle distances from essential services and recommendations. The good part is most of the city has these opportunities, but it's about building on the strengths and making sure that the policy to do that remains an important part. And then what we saw was online, we got a lot of the similar feedback. So online, the top priority based on voting, and people could vote for a number 1 and a number 2 choice online, and then that was weighted. But encouraging that redevelopment that locates people near walkable and bikeable distances from essential services was also number 1 online. So this is where there was kind of synergy in what we heard from people when they took these surveys with what we heard from people when they came to participate in our focus groups and discussions. And I'm not going to walk through all of these objectives, but I would say that's kind of similar theme and pattern was reinforced both online and at the charrette. Preliminary recommendations. We spent a lot of time on 3 key areas, and this is presented on these boards back here. We're going to kind of expand on that a little bit in the next couple days. You know, one of the key things on Mission Street, which is one of the issues, we're kind of creating a corridor plan for Mission Street. We wanted to really test the zoning code to see how it could be implemented. And the picture on the upper left here is a multi-lane boulevard, but it's a multi-lane boulevard that would be designed kind of to change the right-of-way line to match the existing setbacks and create a slip street. And that's kind of one approach to retrofitting a corridor, boulevard-style corridor. But what we found was there was really strong support for infilling between that existing right-of-way line to the building facade. So really matching what the true intent of the zoning code, which was to move and change the style of development in that district to a zero lot line corridor. So what we wound up doing was kind of going through that process where we tested the zoning code and then landing on a modern boulevard that took on some of the recommendations that we know have been pursued in the past, a series of roundabouts and some crossing islands, but to do that and put that in the context of a walkable multimodal space that provides opportunity for crossing, that provides on-street parking for the new businesses. I mean, if the code wants zero lot line businesses, that's great. In order to support zero lot line businesses, you need on-street parking, just like downtown. That's why it works downtown. There's parking in front, there's parking in back, but you kind of need that combination. So we developed that into that idea a little bit, and then we've worked that a little bit further to that 2050 build out. And our next phase for this analysis is to look at our economic development studies, the market study, the target housing study, to come up with 5-year, 10-year build-out scenarios and show you how to basically try to create a retrofitted grid that allows for some near-term development, but allows for a planning horizon of 30 years to support the re-envisioning of this corridor. And you know, this is basically what a grid would look like centered on Mission Street if you were to build out on that 30-year planning horizon. In the interim, we'd really be looking at supportive development along the nodes and spot infill development throughout the process. We did look at the town center. What we found was there's kind of a lighter approach to developing town center, kind of matching what's existing there, but prioritizing the public spaces and providing an opportunity for public gathering and possibly some complementary housing to the Riverview apartments, and making sure that as this happens, the connection to Island Park is made. And then we did look at Pickard Street. I know the city is kind of in the process of making a decision on how to proceed with Pickard Street. I think what we heard clearly was that the connection to the river park system and the linear trail system, and also creating east-west access along Pickard, was a huge opportunity. We actually looked at 2 scenarios, kind of how would you do an off-street path versus how you could do a 3-lane conversion to create bike access. And I think looking at the data, I think they both work. I know this is something the city's looking at. From my perspective, I do think that the road diet is a lot cheaper. So in terms of infrastructure investment, you're getting kind of more bang for your buck from a multimodal perspective with that option. But there's a lot of things to consider. So we've kind of paused this part of our kind of development plan to wait for advice and to continue to kind of talk through those issues. Where are kind of the big picture citywide recommendations? We took some of this to develop and talk about the future transportation system. I think there's three big themes here that are kind of outside of the Mission Street and the trail connectivity. One, consensus around the rerouting of M20 to Pickard Street. And I don't think that this conflicts with the idea of doing a road diet on Pickard Street. It's a 3-lane in many places now. But we did hear that rerouting would be beneficial. So I think that's a recommendation we want to make. Also, that kind of connection along University between downtown and the campus was a really strong north-south connection that we want to accentuate with the future transportation plan. And then the modern boulevard along Mission Street was obviously something that rose to the top. So we've started to kind of create that into a typology system where not only are we mapping the types of street typologies which will be applied to standards, but also what the key intersections are. Really, in order to make the system of roundabouts on Mission Street work, we also need the gateways and the intersections that stop the traffic to allow penetration from bicycles and pedestrians across. And of course, one of the benefits to signalized intersection is that you can time it so that during peak hours and during events, it allows for a priority along Mission Street so that can be free flow during certain times and controlled during other times. And there's operational solutions to help with that design. So we are planning to continue to work with MDOT, work with the university, but we did get broad consensus in the charrette that this direction was something that the city, MDOT, and the CMU were working on and actively working to achieve. And this is an example of what that multimodal corridor would look like in cross-section view and two-dimensional view. Essentially what it's showing is that to create the city wall, to create that outdoor space, you want the 2-story minimum buildings at the lot line. Certainly the Mission Street zoning district permits even higher than that. I think it goes up to 5. Is that right, Jacob? In part, yeah. In part. But you need the on-street parking. You need the pedestrian space, bike parking, refuge islands to create safe crossing areas. It's all a part. And of course, 2 vehicle lanes still supports the amount of traffic that needs to go through there. So I did present to the park system. Obviously, we're doing an analysis and an inventory of the park system. And part of that is describing the natural features in the city and describing how the city's park system relates to all of the regional park system. For future land use, I think this is kind of one of the more exciting things we did at the charrette. We basically did a collaborative new future land use map for the city. And to approach that, we had a bunch of people that attended that session, and everyone got their own blank map. And we started by looking at the zoning code, looking at the old future land use map, and brainstorming what we wanted the districts to be on the new map. And then everybody independently drew their own future land use map based on those tools that we had to look at. Then we split up into 2 groups, and the challenge for each group was to basically create one consensus map, to use everybody's ideas that they'd put on their own map into one map. And then each group presented their combined map, and then we worked on one combined map that incorporated the discussion from both of those groups. And that essentially is the map that you see here with a little bit of quality control provided by Jacob and myself. And I'm really happy with this product. I'm happy to be at a point where I feel like we have a really vetted map at this point that is also aligned with the zoning process. It's a good place to be. And then, of course, we have the opportunity to define those districts a little bit and present our recommendations for form and for character along with each of those districts. So, next steps. Where are we at? The charrette process really allows us to be at this point now where we have done a substantial amount of public engagement. We have a substantial amount of public engagement to present as part of the plan. We have, vetted goals and objectives, and a substantial amount of what I would consider to be the bulk of the, policy recommendations for the plan, represented by our 3 character areas and the transportation map and the future land use map. So our goal, in this meeting is to get some feedback, to check in with the commissions that are responsible for being the implementers on this and caretaking it and being invested in achieving the vision. I've had some good comments and going to use those comments to create a draft. And that 70% draft we want to bring back. We're targeting August, it might be September, but we want to make sure that that is a substantive draft that's ready for your comments so that we can take those comments and basically create the draft plan that we would take into the adoption process. I would say that the adoption process is also a major part of the public process. There's regulations attached to it. We do want the public's feedback on all of the plans. There's a 63-day review period where we'll be accepting comments, and everything people tell us will be a part of that process. There will be a public hearing here after the process concludes. We also will be doing a public hearing with a 30-day notice for the Parks Commission, and ultimately the whole process will be asking to be adopted by the City Commission. Our timeline allows us to target those approvals for winter, early spring of 2020, which will really allow us to have, really quality time for the commissions to review documents. We don't want people to feel rushed, and we've got time to basically allow for a substantive review. But it's exciting. I think we've heard a lot of good things. I think we benefited from the city going through a zoning update. A lot of the ideas about the future development for the city, there's people invested in them. So this is really a good time to look at the master plan and to look at it with an eye for the future. So that's my presentation. And I'm here for questions.
Yeah, I do have a question on that plan for Mission Street. What would be the total width on that?
It's the same. So we want to do the modern boulevard within the current right-of-way. So one of the things that we're going to need to continue to work with MDOT to discuss is what are the design values that we're comfortable with on that corridor, and what are the design objectives.
Realistically, what's the chance that MDOT's going to drop $50 million to rebuild that street?
I don't know that it will be that expensive. You're probably in the ballpark. But I think that a part of the proposal is to create a vision that is not just a transportation vision, it's a land use vision. And the zoning ordinance creates a valuable redevelopment opportunity. So I think that the public investment is appropriate for the type of private investment that the city's envisioning there. And MDOT's a partner, so we've got to approach it by, developing process, developing priorities, and, developing a project that we can seek to get funded, and identifying what the partners are to get it funded.
Okay, so bottom line is, it's not likely to happen.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, we met with several people from MDOT during the charrette, and we got approval, concept approval for the idea of doing a roundabout. I mean, not a roundabout, but doing roundabouts and looking at the corridor as part of a reconstruction. And, it's not, reconstructing a roadway is not something that MDOT doesn't do. They do it all the time. So,
Well, I understand.
but budgeting and planning for it is something that, what we're suggesting is the city needs to invest in the vision and work with MDOT on it. And I know that's what the city's objective is, but that's how these major projects get done. They don't get done because nobody wants them to get done. They get done because everybody
I
wants
understand all that, but I mean, MDOT's been spending 6 years on the Pickett Street project and somehow just haven't got around to finishing it yet, so you understand that that has to be viewed with some skepticism.
I'm familiar with skepticism. I'm okay with it.
Okay, all right.
How wide is the modern boulevard that you've drawn? Like, how wide across? From the very edge of the sidewalk to the sidewalk? And
Oops. I think that right-of-way is 120 feet. It might be 100 feet. I don't remember, but I know we had the plans. But you can design a multimodal boulevard within a 100-foot profile, and it might be 109. I was thinking that that's why we were evaluating the setbacks, because the current setback is I think it's a 50-foot setback.
no,
that right?
it's 0.
Prior setback.
The prior setback was a 50-foot setback. So in a 50-foot setback, you can basically put an entire road, like a parallel slip.
Right, but if a new building builds at the 0 setback up to the sidewalk, that just one building will block this whole strategy. That's why I'm questioning it.
That's the strategy that we're recommending is basically a reconstruction that would happen within the existing profile. And there is space to create this boulevard within that existing profile.
From curb to curb or sidewalk to sidewalk?
It's from sidewalk to sidewalk. So the right-of-way is from, what is often the edge of one sidewalk to the edge of the other. But often there's no sidewalk, and it's hard to kind of tell where it is, but it's there. The space is there for that cross-section that we're looking at.
So there won't be an apron anymore. That will be parking and things like that.
That's what we have to get agreement to, right? So, and I do think that's a sticking point, right? If you want a 0 lot line building, I would make the case, and I have made the case, that you need on-street parking to support retail in that type of a context, basically. So if we want to do all of the transportation business within the right-of-way line, we have to accommodate parking in it. It's basically, we have to do it in order to build what we want to build via the zoning ordinance. So, and it can be done. I'm not concerned with the dimensions, but it's agreeing on the design values and the objectives, because there there's decisions to be made on what's prioritized for design. And in order to design a space that would support the land use that the zoning already supports, you have to make that a priority in the design decisions you make on the corridor as well. And I think that we've gotten good feedback both from your two partners, MDOT and CMU, really, they were at the table and we're talking about it. And it's not something that's gonna happen tomorrow, but with this plan in place, with the right players in place, we can map the course to moving towards that vision. That's what the master plan's for.
Do we know what the state right-of-way is along Mission? Is it 30 each side of Center, or is it wider?
It's, the entire corridor is different on every part of the corridor.
No, I'm
Essentially,
talking about the most narrow part.
I don't believe it gets much narrower than 100 feet in the whole corridor, and that's primarily going to be north of Bellows Street, which is not an area where, north of Bellows, there's no roundabouts proposed in that draft transportation plan.
So there actually is room there.
There's a significant number of areas south of Broomfield Road that are over 150 feet of right of way. And it really just comes down to, it wasn't that many decades ago that Mission Street was 2 lanes.
Yes,
And
it took a heck
so
of a fight to get it widened
the
out.
development came in many cases before the road, and so they've kind of chipped away and bought and gathered and taken right of way where they could get it.
Yep.
And so if you look at the map, it's a real jagged edge, and it gets, I would say, it gets worse the further south you get. I think because they had more opportunities to get extra right of way in the south end, and so where they could get it, they got it, and so it's like, for instance, Texas Roadhouse. It's basically 0 lot line, but it's 25 plus feet from the back of the curb to the front of that building. North end of Mission Street, the right-of-way line is the front of the building. So it's, and it's the back of the sidewalk, and the sidewalk is a foot from the curb. So it's for better or worse, just different everywhere.
Yeah. You're thinking at the narrowest point, it's 100?
That's what I want to say. I mean, at the narrowest point north of Bellows, or, particularly between High and Pickard, you've got a 5-lane cross-section with sidewalks on both sides, and I don't believe it gets below 100. It might get to 80, but even in that section, we're primarily talking about the retrofit happening from Bellows South, and for Bellows South, the right-of-way is by and large significantly wider.
That confirms, I measured and looked at the right-of-way along the whole thing, and I have cross-sections with the numbers in it, and we've got the plan drawings that are drawn to scale, and it fits. That's what we're showing there, but I think 100 feet is what I remembered as kind of that minimum design district.
So
or
it'd
design.
be a modern boulevard to Bellows, and then just a 5-lane beyond Bellows?
Beyond Bellows, I kind of called it a retrofit, and the reason why I called it a thoroughfare retrofit is because it's really about the character of the development. I think a lot more of those buildings are, pretty much designed at what is functionally a 0 lot line, and they've got side parking lots. And what we want to do is kind of do a more thorough analysis about which of those buildings we think are savable, and not savable because they're fine now, but in the long run, will be consistent with the code. And I think the retrofit basically is more of a opportunistically look at redevelopment, if parking can be created for a small portion of it, guidelines for access management. But I don't see it as being really something that we would want to look for, like a single developer to do a major development process along with, major reconstruction process. Unless it rises to the top that it makes sense to do the entire length of the corridor at once, we would still likely have a design transition based on the changing of the context of those areas. But I tend to think that the northern portion of it could be retrofitted over time with some resurfacing and spot implementation.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Next item on the agenda is staff report. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a second reminder that our June meeting is, or sorry, our July meeting is very soon, June 27th, Thursday, June 27th. So just please make note of that on your calendars.
Any anticipated agenda items?
Well, at the very least, you'll have a public hearing on the text change that you set tonight. And at this point, that's all I'm certain of.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Meeting's adjourned.